Welcome back to the Metro on WDET. I'm Robin Vincent. The country is grappling with a chilling escalation in political violence. On Saturday, as millions of people protested what they see as President Trump's federal overreach, an assassin allegedly killed a former Minnesota state lawmaker and her husband. The assailant allegedly wounded another legislator and his wife. The victims were on a manifesto with about 70 names connected to abortion rights advocates and Democratic officials. Then last month, 2 Israeli embassy workers were killed in Washington, D.C. And in April, an arsonist set fire to the governor's mansion in Pennsylvania. Those are just some of the incidents from this year. Historian Jeremy Surrey from the University of Texas at Austin says this tension and violence is nothing new. It echoes painful and chaotic chapters from America's past. The assassination of Lincoln, the social upheaval of the 1960s, the January 6th insurrection, and its aftershocks. Today, Jeremy Surrey joins us to explore how history repeats itself, what, if anything, is unique about this moment, and what it all means for our democracy. Professor Surrey, welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me on, Robin. Always good to be with you.
So I want to start with what's happening right now. In Los Angeles, Trump deployed active U.S. Marines and National Guard troops. Marines carried out the first known detention of a civilian on Friday. Then on Saturday, Trump held a military parade on his birthday. During that time, a Minnesota state lawmaker was shot and another was wounded, as I mentioned. What do you make of all of that's happening right now? And is it fair to say we're at code red?
Well, I'm not sure if we're at code red because I don't know what code red means anymore. We've crossed so many lines. But we have entered another very violent period in our history. Our history is filled with peaks and valleys of more violence and less violence, and it has to do with the political conditions. It has to do with the leadership we have, and it has to do with the economy. And what is maybe bringing us to code red is that we have a leader who glorifies violence, who speaks with words that encourage violence. We have economic conditions that have created, I think, for many people, deep frustration, anxiety, and concerns about new people competing with them, and that causes violent actions. And then we have a number of actors out there in the community who see opportunity for themselves to take advantage of this. And in many cases, our law enforcement right now is focused perhaps on the wrong things, focused on deporting people who are peaceful, hard workers in our society, rather than protecting the community.
Professor Surrey, I'm wondering what risks are posed to democratic norms when we talk about things like, let's say, military-style parades and deployments of the U.S. military to control crowds.
Well, traditionally, we have not had military parades, with very few exceptions at the end of wars, to celebrate the end of a war, not to celebrate the military. Because going back to our founders, Robin, there was a belief that a democracy should not have a strong standing military, nor should a democracy be built around the military. It should be built around civilian control of the military. And the idea of a citizen soldier, not a soldier ruler. And for that reason, I think it's very important that we emphasize in all circumstances that our military and our policing forces, they are not the people who rule our society. It is elected officials, it is citizens with rights, and it is courts that rule our society. There is no branch of government called the military. There's an executive with civilian leadership, a judiciary with civilian leadership, a legislature with civilian leadership. And so it's dangerous when we forget that, or when we are encouraged to believe that somehow our country is defined by warriors. It is not. It is defined by citizens and civilians.
So in other words, these are abnormal times, but Professor Surrey, you've long traced a through line of political violence in American history, from Lincoln's assassination to the January 6th insurrection. And you earlier were talking about those peaks and valleys. How does this moment compare?
Well, in some ways, this moment is normal. I mean, I think the point I'm trying to make as a historian is that there are different kinds of normal. We have the normal of maybe what you and I experienced growing up, which was a slightly more peaceful society. But there's also the normal that African Americans experienced in my state of Texas through the 1920s and 1960s for 40, 50 years, where violence was everywhere, more violence than we see today. If you were an African American male growing up in Texas, you saw more violence than you do today. So, unfortunately, as great a society as we are, and I'm the child of immigrants, so I think we are a great society. At the same time, we're a very violent society, and we've long been very, very violent. And I think what that means for this moment right now is we have to be attentive to the lessons of history from those other moments. And the one I would put at the top of the list that you've already implied so well is that in these moments of violence, we have to be very careful about protecting communities that are vulnerable, because the vulnerable communities will be the ones that will suffer. And I think we're seeing that already. There's the violence towards politicians, but really the violence towards immigrants, the violence towards people of color in our society right now who are simply going about their lives, trying to take their kids to school, trying to go to work wherever they work. And the violence that they confront today is not unique to this moment, but it has deep, deep effects on all of us. And that's what history teaches us.
So it is not unique. Would you say that it is a more unstable moment than, say, the 90s? Or are some of us being overly concerned right now about political violence? In other words, are we especially focused on it because of certain things that have emerged, and so then one's attention becomes that more squarely placed on events like this?
It's a terrific question. I do think it's a bit more unstable, and I believe that's the case because we now have a party and national leadership, and in some cases state leadership, that it's not clear feels it is bounded by the Constitution. And in other periods of violence, there has been lots of unconstitutional behavior in those periods too, but there's generally been a consensus, not always, generally been a consensus that the Constitution provides at least some guidelines. And that is why you have not had a president before this one issuing so many blatantly unconstitutional orders. That is why you have seen in the past no military parades. There is a moment where I do feel that there are a group of leaders now who really just don't care about the Constitution, and that's a bit unique and a bit scarier than what we've seen before.
This is the Metro on WDET. I'm Robin Vincent. We're discussing the rise of political violence in the United States on the heels of the assassination of a Minnesota lawmaker. Our guest is Professor Jeremy Surrey. He's a historian from the University of Texas at Austin who studies political violence. Professor Surrey, I want to look at something that does seem to make this moment versus other times of upheaval feel different, and that is the internet. I'm thinking about the rise of so-called online assassination culture. How does that kind of rhetoric and radicalization in digital spaces translate to the real-world violence that we're seeing?
Well, it's certainly one of the unique elements of our moment. Not that there's violent rhetoric or encouragement of hate. I spent a lot of time reading old newspapers. I love reading old newspapers.
Same.
And you see this in newspapers in the 1870s and 80s and 90s. You also see the spread of lies. In fact, if you look at an old newspaper, you can do this through the Library of Congress website from, let's say, 1875 from Dallas, Texas. It looks a lot like a Facebook page today with aggregated stories of hate and lies. So the spread of those sorts of violent languages of different kinds, that's not unique. But you're right. What is unique is the rapidity and I think the saturation we all feel with images, evocative images, images that sort of we look at them and they trigger us in one way or another. And I think that's a real issue. I think that's a real issue, especially for a younger generation that hasn't learned to filter this. And I think it is triggering more action, more violence, more immediacy to this. And I do think that is one of the real concerns we have now. And I'm astonished that there has not been more done to create more methods for encouraging labeling and monitoring of this on sites like Facebook and Twitter. I think Twitter is an entirely irresponsible site for this sort of material.
So, given your astonishment, Professor Suri, would you say social media is a contemporary incubator for political violence?
Absolutely. It's a contemporary incubator for violence, for lies, for confusion. Absolutely, yes.
I'm wondering what are the violations of the Constitution that you're most concerned about?
I'm concerned about three. I mean, I'm concerned about 100, but there are three in particular for the purpose of our conversation that I will pick out. The first is habeas corpus. This was actually at the core of the American Revolution, in fact, that foreign soldiers or imperial police should not have the right to enter our homes, should not have the right to incarcerate us, should not have the right to search through our homes without our being understanding, first of all, what our rights are, and then if we are arrested, our right to know what the charge is and confront that charge. And when we have a head of Homeland Security, Secretary Kristi Noem, who, when asked by Congress, doesn't even know what habeas corpus is, I'm just telling the facts here. People can watch the video. She doesn't even know what it is. This basic protection, that worries me because I know how often in our history, and we're a society that generally follows the rule of law, how often in our society people have been wrongfully arrested and incarcerated. Think of the Japanese Americans incarcerated during World War II without habeas corpus. So habeas corpus is number one on my list. Number two on my list is free speech, believe it or not, because I think there's been an absolute effort by certain entities to intimidate and chill free speech. I've seen this on college campuses. People are afraid to talk about the Middle East. People are afraid to say certain things about what's happening around them in their communities. And this is happening everywhere. People fear they will lose their law clients. They will lose their business if they speak up. So that's a second issue.
Professor Suri, before
Yes.
you give us your third, can you explain habeas corpus for folks who might not understand it?
Yes, of course. So the right of habeas corpus is it goes back. It long precedes the United States, and that's why it's a Latin term. And the right of habeas corpus is the right once if I am arrested or incarcerated or somehow face judicial limits on my freedom, I have the right to know what the charge is and to confront that charge. Habeas corpus means I cannot be held indefinitely without charge, without recourse against that charge. This is what has happened to some of the immigrants who have been arrested. They have been arrested on the streets of Massachusetts, Boston, or New York, or wherever else, moved somewhere, and they don't even know what the charges are against them. We don't know who has charged them for what, and you can't confront that if you don't have any knowledge, if you're just being held indefinitely.
What has been your reaction to some of those detainments of immigrants just disappearing off the streets?
It's one of the most chilling things. Obviously, the assassination attempts and unfortunately successful assassination of legislators and elected officials in Minnesota and elsewhere, that's obviously horrifying. But honestly, equally horrifying, if not more horrifying, is to see in our society right now people being disappeared, kind of Chilean style from the 1970s, where you don't know where the person is, who has them, why they've been taken, and when they've been taken by people in masks who don't even fully identify themselves. That is not just a violation of civil rights. That's a violation of basic democratic governance. Democratic governance is built around consent of the governed, which means that when someone's freedom is taken away, whether they're a citizen or not, there have to be recourses, first of all, to check that there is reason to do that, and then for those who have been denied certain rights to have the opportunity to confront and contest that. Disappearing doesn't allow that.
Thank you for allowing me to derail you there for a moment. We were talking about violations to the Constitution that are concerning to you, and one is habeas corpus. Thank you for explaining that. And second is free speech violations. What's the third?
The third one is uncontrolled executive power. And I don't mean just the sending of the stealing of the National Guard from the California governor and the sending of Marines to Los Angeles. That's pretty bad. But what I mean is actually violating explicit congressional instruction. So when Congress creates an agency and you just decide because you're president or governor that you're just going to close that agency and you're going to move the money somewhere else, That is a violation of basic separation of powers, and that allows the president to act like a king. That's kingly behavior. And that really bothers me and worries me because I'm seeing people obviously losing their jobs. I'm seeing services in our country being denied to people. My daughter was supposed to get training as a middle school teacher through AmeriCorps, and they summarily just cut the funding for that, so she wasn't getting her training. That's an example of unleashed and unbounded executive authority. And then I wonder, what is that money going to be used for? And will the president start telling agencies to do things that explicitly violate what Congress told them to do? And that's a real violation of everything our revolution in 1776 was about.
Professor Suri, I think some people are listening to what you're saying right now and perhaps feeling a little hopeless. If there was one thing that we can do to strengthen democracy, what would it be?
I think we all have to speak up. I think the historical record is clear that in moments of violence and violation of the Constitution, the truest and most successful check is the people. There are elections happening all the time. We need to elect leaders who care about democracy. That starts with our local elections. It starts with our congressional elections. And local officials, members of Congress, have a lot of power. And then we need to be in the streets, and people need to hear us, and they need to see us, and they need to understand what we care about. You cannot take action in the United States without some degree of public support. And what we saw, I think, with the No Kings protests, which were largely, almost entirely peaceful, is exactly what we need to see more. People need to speak out. They need to talk to their neighbors. That uncle or aunt of yours who likes Trump's parading around, that you need to have a conversation with them. It is the people who protect our democracy. That's always been the case, and we can do that today. And I see so many positive elements of that. I think we were complacent, Robin, for too long. And I think a lot of good people, moderate people, as well as progressives, are activated in this moment.
It sounds like you are echoing the title of your Substack newsletter, which is Democracy of Hope. I do want to turn back, Professor Suri, to the subject of political violence before I let you go. You've written about America's unfinished civil war in your book, Civil War by Other Means, America's Long and Unfinished Fight for Democracy. What steps, legislative, cultural, educational, do you think are needed to turn back from the political violence that we're seeing right now in our country?
Well, I think a number of things need to be done. At the federal level, we need to do more to limit the misuse of power by presidents and other officials. Our laws have not kept up with the ways in which the executive has misused power. And one thing I would do is, and I talk about this in my book, limit or take away the president's pardoning power. President Trump pardoned the insurrectionists on January 6th, all of the people who broke into the Capitol, attacked police officers, defaced a sacred building of ours. They were all pardoned by the president. And if an executive figure, whether a president or a governor, can pardon people for committing violence, that creates an incentive for them to act violently if they're not going to be punished. I worry quite a bit about those insurrectionists from January 6th who think they can do this, who think they can go and attack other people. So we need to tighten up our laws at the federal level. At the local level, I think what we need to do is we need to take more action to discourage the violence that is being seen on social media, that is encouraged by extremist groups. There has to be a groundswell of action, as we've seen at other times in our history, to say this is not acceptable in our community. It's not acceptable to advocate violence. It's not acceptable to call for violence. It's not acceptable to call the other party traitorous and to basically encourage harm to people. That has to be penalized, not necessarily with incarceration. People should have free speech, but that should be penalized with condemnation. We should condemn violent rhetoric and violent behavior. We should not allow that to become a norm. Unfortunately, I see too many people, particularly young men today, who think that acting violently is an appropriate way of being a citizen. It is not an appropriate way of being a citizen, and that has to start in our local communities.
Historian Jeremy Suri from the University of Texas at Austin. His Substack newsletter is titled Democracy of Hope. His podcast is This is Democracy. Professor Suri, thank you so much for joining us again on the Metro.
Robin, thank you. My pleasure.
Coming up, a young actor got his start just across the river in Windsor. We'll hear about how and what he's doing now. We'll be right back here on the Metro. Stay with us.